When my son told me I wasn't invited to Christmas, I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I went home, made one phone call, and stopped their mortgage payments. By January, their bank had questions they couldn't answer. That was only step one. Some lessons can't be taught gently. Before we go any further, take a second to subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're joining me from. I want to see just how far this story travels. It started with pie. Jason always loved my pecan pie. Not the store-bought kind, but the one I made every Thanksgiving with dark corn syrup, toasted halves, and a dash of cinnamon his grandma swore was the secret. He'd sit at the kitchen counter as a boy, legs too short to touch the floor, waiting for the filling to bubble. I thought if I brought it up again, we could start from something warm. I was sitting on his new couch, the one upholstered in that stiff gray fabric Alyssa said matched the minimalist aesthetic. It felt like sitting on a bench at a fancy airport lounge, nice to look at, but no one stays long. Jason had handed me tea in a glass mug. No coaster. He knew better. The heat kissed my fingertips, but the room was cold. Or maybe it was just them. I was thinking I could bring the pie this year, I said. I even smiled a little. The one with the bourbon vanilla. Remember how Nana used to say it beat hers by a mile? He nodded, barely. Alyssa's candles flickered on the console table. Vanilla, heavy and artificial. I hated how they masked the smell of a home. Nothing familiar lived here. The walls were white. Not eggshell or cream, sterile, rental white. The kind that dares you to hang a memory. Jason shifted, his wedding band catching the light like a nervous tick. I noticed his hands were dry. They used to be full of calluses when he helped me rebuild the deck after that spring flood. That was a long time ago. Before life got curated. Mom, he started. His voice had that soft edge people use before they drop a bomb. We need to talk about Christmas. My stomach tightened. I smiled again. The polite kind. The one women my age master in waiting rooms and family gatherings. He looked past me, toward the fireplace I helped them tile last year. My hands had ached for weeks after that job, but I hadn't said a word. Alyssa wanted charcoal slate. Modern, she said. You won't be coming this year. I blinked. I'm sorry. Alyssa's parents are flying in from Seattle, and, well, it's just easier this way. I stared at the coffee table. Marble. I'd paid for half of it when they moved in. He couldn't meet my eyes. I tried to understand. I really did. Easier for who? He swallowed. They have traditions. Expectations. They're particular. My eyes moved around the room. The curtains I bought when Alyssa wanted privacy. The bar stools from that little shop I found in Austin. The custom rug she just had to have, because standard ones shed. Every corner of that home had my fingerprints. My savings. My good intentions. Easier, I said. The word tasted like old metal. And where exactly would I go, then? Jason fumbled. Maybe Aunt Ruth's? Or we could do something the weekend after. A separate dinner. Separate. Like an afterthought. A side dish to the main meal. I set down my tea. The heat had faded. Alyssa's voice drifted in from the kitchen, something about imported chocolate. I looked at the mixer. Not the cheap kind. The industrial, chrome-plated beast that had been on her birthday wish list. I remembered the bill. It cost more than my first car. I stood. My knees cracked louder than I liked. I walked slowly to the coat rack, built-in, sleek, impersonal. Jason followed me but didn't speak. I passed a photo on the wall. A family shot. I was in it, off to the side, blurred just enough to feel erased. At the door, my hand wrapped around the handle. Cool and smooth. I paused. Tell Alyssa's parents I said happy holidays. I didn't wait for a response. Outside, the sky had shifted. The air had that dry chill, sharp at the edges. My truck sat alone on the curb. I opened the door, sat inside, and waited a moment before starting the engine. Across the street, a boy pulled a sled across a lawn barely dusted with snow. His mother laughed from the porch. I watched them until they disappeared. The lights in Jason's window blinked on. Warm, golden, beautiful. Behind them, my son prepared for a celebration I wouldn't be part of. They told me not to come. I smiled. But not because I understood. It's strange what you notice when you're no longer welcome. The porch tiles, they were the first thing. I remembered them clearly because my knees had ached for a week after helping Jason lay them. Dark slate, rough texture, just like Alyssa had pinned in her dream entryway mood board. We'd spent an entire weekend measuring and grouting, arguing over spacing while a summer thunderstorm rolled outside. At the time, it felt like love. Family. Now, each step I took away from that house sounded like a goodbye I hadn't rehearsed. The December air was colder than it should have been. Dry, not quite freezing, but sharp enough to bite. I pulled my coat tight as I walked to my truck. My boots scraped against the edge of their driveway, the one I helped seal 2 winters ago. Jason said he'd get around to it but never did. So I did. Like always. The truck groaned as I climbed in. It was old. Not classic, just old. The seat cushion had a tear on the driver's side, patched with duct tape. The heater took its time waking up, humming low and inconsistent. I let it run while I sat there, staring at the lights in their living room window. Warm. Cozy. The kind of glow that sells candles in glossy catalogs. Inside, they were probably moving on. Laughing. Planning place settings. Pretending they hadn't just drawn a line I wasn't meant to cross. I didn't cry. Instead, I shifted into drive and pulled away from the curb. My headlights swept across the snowless lawn, across the same bush I had trimmed in spring when Jason was too busy. The same front step I repainted last fall when Alyssa said the peeling paint was bad for curb appeal. Every inch of that house had a piece of me in it. My hands, my money, my time. But not, apparently, my presence. I drove slow. The streets in their neighborhood were lined with carefully spaced trees and recycled holiday wreaths. Silent reindeer on front lawns, battery-powered candles in every window. The kind of place where families pretended their lives were perfectly curated. Where everything looked warm on the outside, no matter how cold it really was. At a stoplight, I caught a glimpse of myself in the rearview mirror. My lipstick had faded. There were lines around my mouth I didn't remember noticing before. I adjusted the mirror down. Better not to look. I passed the corner where Jason had crashed his bike when he was 8. He cried so hard, convinced he broke his leg. I carried him home piggyback, even though he was almost too big. That same stretch of sidewalk still had the faint chalk lines we used to draw rockets and hopscotch on. I doubted anyone had looked at them in years. The heater finally kicked in. I turned the dial up, listening to the way the air pushed through the vents. It smelled like old dust and something faintly metallic. I hadn't changed the filter in months. I'd been meaning to, but every spare dollar had gone to them. Always them. Alyssa's parents. Expectations. Atmosphere. The words repeated in my head like bad radio. I wanted to believe Jason was caught in the middle. That he hated telling me I wasn't welcome. But the way he avoided my eyes. The way his voice got smaller, like a child backing away from responsibility. No. He chose. And he chose comfort. I turned left onto Maple. Past the coffee shop where Jason used to study for exams. I'd bring him sandwiches in a paper bag. He'd smile like it was Christmas. That boy used to love me with no filter. No conditions. No shared Google calendars. I remember the first time he brought Alyssa to dinner. She wore beige. Beige blouse, beige nails, beige opinions. She smiled without teeth. She told me my lasagna was rustic and that Jason had mentioned my quirky kitchen. I didn't know back then that quirky meant outdated. Now, my tamales were too spicy and my music was a bit much. My jokes, apparently, didn't land with people who vacationed in the Hamptons. I turned into my driveway. The crack in the concrete was bigger than last month. I'd been planning to get it fixed, but then their garbage disposal broke, and they really needed help just until next paycheck. The porch light flickered as I stepped out. Still needed a new bulb. I'd bought the wrong wattage twice. That's the thing about living alone. No one reminds you when you forget. Inside, the air was stale in a way you only notice when you come back from somewhere expensive. The furnace clicked on. The fridge hummed. My house sounded tired. I dropped my purse on the counter, shrugged off my coat, and stood in the kitchen. I reached for the tea kettle out of habit. Then stopped. There were no vanilla candles here. No granite countertops. The tiles under my feet were linoleum, peeling in one corner. I'd meant to replace them last spring. I thought about Jason's kitchen. Polished steel. That massive mixer. The one I'd paid for when Alyssa went through her baking therapy phase. $2,000 for 3 batches of cupcakes and an Instagram story. I looked at my stove. The oven light was broken. The clock blinked 12 o'clock like it had been doing for months. I never bothered to reset it. There was no one to cook for anymore. No reason to know the time. I walked to the hallway. Past the framed photo from Jason's high school graduation. He had his arm around me. Back then, he leaned into me. Now, he leaned away. Further down, another photo. Jason, Alyssa, their wedding. I wasn't in that frame. I had been there. Paid for the wine. Bought the veil. But I wasn't in the picture. Funny how that works. I stared at the wall for a long time. At the shadows cast by the overhead light. Everything looked dimmer than I remembered. Or maybe I was just starting to see it clearly. I left the house I once called home, and no one asked me to stay. The kitchen was quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet you find in early mornings or slow Sundays. This one was heavier. It pressed into the walls, settled in the corners. A quiet that came from knowing nobody would walk in. Nobody was coming home late, or early, or ever. I sat at the table, same one I'd had since Maria was alive. Scratched oak, one leg slightly uneven, always needing a napkin folded underneath to keep it from wobbling. The overhead light buzzed, faintly, and the bulb flickered every now and then like it couldn't decide if it still belonged here. In front of me was a pile of manila folders, thick with papers that had no smell but somehow carried a weight. I opened one and pulled out the first bank statement. January. $2,900. Auto transfer. Same amount. Same date. Every month. I flipped to February. Then March. April. May. 12 pages later, I realized I hadn't taken a single breath. My tea had gone cold beside me. The mug still had a faint lipstick stain on the rim, plum-colored. Maria used to laugh at how I never finished a cup. Now I was the only one left not finishing anything. I got up, turned on the kettle, and grabbed a yellow legal pad from the junk drawer. The one where pens went to die, where twist ties and faded receipts lived long past their purpose. I found a pen that worked on the third try. I started to add. 12 months, $2,900. That was $34,800 a year. Times 5 years. $174,000. I wrote the number slowly, letting it stare back at me in ink that trembled slightly from my hand. That wasn't even counting the down payment. I remembered the day Jason told me about the house. It's perfect, Mom. We just need a little help to close. The word little had done a lot of work in that sentence. The closing costs had been nearly $18,000. I'd pulled it from the CD Maria and I opened the year Jason turned 10. We were going to use it to travel when we retired. We never made it to Europe. Or even Santa Fe. I flipped another folder open. Appliance receipts. The gas stove Alyssa wanted because electric was too uneven. The fridge that had to have the double-door French style, with the ice maker in front. I saw a receipt for a set of Japanese knives, over $600. She said they'd last a lifetime. I had used one once while visiting. It felt cold in my hand. I added those up too. The numbers climbed like ivy, quietly, insistently. New bathroom tiles. Crown molding. A custom shelving unit from a craftsman in Oregon. I remembered that invoice because I had driven it to them myself, wrapped in wool blankets in the back of my truck. They were out of town, skiing. Left me a code to their garage door. I thought I was being helpful. I thought helping meant being needed. And if I was needed, maybe I'd never be forgotten. I closed the folders and stared at the table. There were moments in life that shift you. Not like an earthquake, sudden and loud. But like erosion. A slow wearing away of something you didn't realize was fading. I couldn't remember the last time Jason thanked me. Not just a passing thanks said out of reflex, but real thanks. The kind that comes with eye contact. With meaning. With memory. I looked around my kitchen. The tile here was cracked. The fridge door stuck if you didn't lift it slightly when pulling. The linoleum curled at the edges. My stove was the same one from 1996. The clock had been broken since Maria's last birthday. I hadn't replaced anything. Not because I couldn't. But because every time I had a little saved, someone else needed it more. Alyssa once said I was too generous for my own good. She said it like a compliment. It wasn't. The kettle screamed. I poured water over an old tea bag. Earl Grey, store brand. The steam fogged my glasses. I didn't wipe them. I sat down again and looked at the numbers. They didn't lie. They didn't make excuses or shift the blame or say, it's just this once. They just sat there. Cold. Sharp. True. I thought about the birthday dinners I paid for. The groceries I'd stocked their fridge with when Jason was between jobs. The utilities I covered when Alyssa got her hours cut. The landscaping. The security system. The emergency dental work. The property taxes they forgot to plan for. The throw pillows she ordered in 3 different colors because she couldn't decide. None of it had my name on it. Not the house deed. Not the photos. Not the party invitations. I was a guest when it was convenient, a burden when it wasn't. I had given them everything I had. Time. Money. Energy. Years I couldn't get back. I reached for another folder. Inside was the signed loan agreement from when I refinanced my house to cover their down payment. I remembered the woman at the bank looking at me with careful pity. She didn't say anything. But her eyes asked all the questions I hadn't let myself ask. Now, I did. Why didn't I stop? Why did I think that love required this kind of giving? Why did it take being uninvited from Christmas to realize I had become invisible? I looked down at the legal pad, numbers lined up like soldiers in a losing battle. I traced them with my finger. Slowly. Then I set the pen down. I had given my whole life. And now, all I had left were receipts. The next morning was still and pale, like the air hadn't quite decided to wake up. Light filtered through the kitchen window in soft, colorless streaks. Outside, the frost clung to the mailbox, delicate and stubborn, refusing to melt even as the sun tried its best to warm the world. I hadn't slept much. My body had rested, but my mind had kept moving, twisting through memories like drawers that wouldn't close. I made oatmeal the old-fashioned way, with milk and brown sugar, just the way Jason used to like when he was little. I set 2 bowls on the table out of habit. Then I paused, sighed, and put one back into the sink. The silence was fuller than usual. Not empty, just wide. Like a room that had finally admitted it wasn't meant to be shared anymore. My phone sat on the counter. The screen was dark. No missed calls. No messages. No questions. No apologies. I picked it up anyway. My fingers hovered over the screen for a long time before I opened the banking app. I already knew the number. I'd entered it hundreds of times. Wells Fargo. Jason and Alyssa's mortgage account. It stared back at me like it had every month for 5 years. A quiet little line on my statement. Automatic transfer. $2,900. On the 15th. No questions asked. No thanks offered. I touched the number. Held my breath. Then I made the call. The line rang twice. Then a click. Then music. Some corporate version of classical, all violins and polish. The kind that makes you feel like you're standing in a well-decorated elevator. A voice came on. Thank you for calling First National. This is Jennifer. How may I assist you today? She sounded young. Polite. Like someone who had never paid a bill with the last $20 in her account. Yes, I said, voice low. I need to cancel an automatic transfer. Certainly, ma'am. May I have the account number associated with the transfer? I read it from memory. No hesitation. There was a pause as she typed. I imagined her in a cubicle somewhere, wearing a headset, a little mug on her desk that said, World's Okayest Employee. I see it here. A recurring payment of $2,900 monthly to an external mortgage account. Last transfer was on the 15th of this month. You've had this scheduled for 5 years? Her tone changed a little at the end. Not judgmental. Just curious. Yes. That's right. And would you like to cancel it immediately? I looked around my kitchen. The chipped tile near the sink. The broken clock above the stove. The draft coming in from the window I never could afford to reseal. I thought about my pantry, how I'd ration groceries to keep enough for that transfer every month. I thought about the birthday dinner I skipped for myself last year because Alyssa's parents wanted to host something upscale, and the bill had landed, silently, on my shoulders. Yes, I said. Effective immediately. Understood. I'm submitting that now. The change will reflect within 24 hours. She asked if I needed anything else. I told her no. She thanked me. I thanked her. Then I hung up. The call had taken less than 4 minutes. I stood there, phone still in my hand, surprised by how steady I felt. No shaking. No regret. No noise. Just space. I poured myself a second cup of coffee. The cheap kind. Instant, not brewed. I usually saved the good stuff for weekends or when company came over. But now, I didn't feel like saving things anymore. Not for them. Not for anyone who didn't show up for me. I walked to the window. Watched the neighbor's dog trot across the lawn, its breath visible in short white puffs. The wind moved the branches gently, as if reminding me the world kept going, even when people stopped showing up in yours. I thought about Jason. Where he might be at that moment. Maybe at work. Maybe at home, planning dinner with Alyssa. Maybe looking at their calendar, seeing a blank space where my name used to be. Did he know? Would he notice when the mortgage wasn't paid next month? Or would Alyssa catch it first? Would she panic? Blame the bank? Call her father? Would they think I forgot? I almost laughed. There was a time when forgetting would have been impossible. When I would have driven across town just to hand them a check in person, just to see Jason's face light up with relief. But that face hadn't looked at me with love in a long time. It was always expectation now. Silent, tired expectation. Like I was a background app running to keep their lives functioning. I set the mug down and walked back to the kitchen table. The folders still sat there. Quiet and still, like tombstones. I placed the phone on top of the last one. Not as a goodbye. But as a marker. The end of a transaction. The beginning of something else. I sat for a moment longer, listening to the hum of the fridge. The soft creak of the wall heater. The tick of the old clock, even though its hands had long since given up. Then I pushed back my chair, stood up, and breathed in the cool, stale air of my kitchen. I didn't feel strong. But I felt finished. And that, for now, was enough. I hung up. And no one pulled me back. The morning after the call, I woke before the sun. Not from worry or noise, but from habit. My body was used to years of waking early, bracing for the next emergency. A missed bill. A last-minute babysitting favor. A panicked voicemail that started with, "Mom, I hate to ask, but..." But nothing came. The house was still, like it had taken a breath and held it. Outside, the frost glazed the window panes in a thin silver film. I traced a finger along the edge of the glass, watching it melt a trail in the cold. For the first time in what felt like forever, I wasn't waiting for anything. No bank transfers. No phone buzz. No disappointment wearing my son's voice. I padded into the kitchen in socks, the old wooden floor creaking under me. The tile under the sink was still chipped. The curtain was still slightly crooked from the time the rod slipped loose. But something about it all felt mine. Not borrowed. Not on loan to anyone else's idea of success. I reached into the cabinet above the stove. Back behind the cans of soup and the extra box of baking soda, there it was. A sealed brown bag of Guatemalan beans. Hand-roasted. Small batch. It had been a gift from Ruth last Christmas. I had set it aside, told myself I'd save it for something special. Funny how I never seemed to define what special meant. I opened the bag slowly, letting the scent rise. Rich. Bold. Just the right touch of earth. It filled the kitchen almost instantly, curling into the corners like something sacred. I measured the grounds carefully. Boiled the water. Let it steep in my old French press, the one with a tiny crack near the base. I poured it into my favorite mug. Not the guest mugs, the fancy ones. Just mine. Faded red with a chipped handle and the words, "One Tough Mother," printed in black. I took a sip. The bitterness was perfect. Like the kind that made you sit still and pay attention. I pulled open the curtains and let in the pale light. It was soft at this hour, low and gentle, like the sun hadn't fully committed to the day. The sky was washed in gray with a hint of lavender at the edges. I turned on the radio, the old one with the dial that always stuck between two stations. I found a jazz program playing something slow. Saxophone, brushed drums, a piano that wandered in and out like it didn't want to be found. I stood for a moment, just listening. Then I preheated the oven and began mixing dough for butter cookies. I hadn't baked for myself in years. I used to make 3 kinds of cookies every December. Jason liked the ones with cranberry and white chocolate. Alyssa pretended to like the almond ones, though she always left them untouched. I rolled the dough between my palms. Pressed it flat. Laid each circle gently on the baking tray lined with parchment paper so old it curled at the edges. The oven ticked as it warmed, metal expanding with heat. While the cookies baked, I cleaned out the pantry. Tossed expired cans. Organized the shelves. Wiped the sticky ring of honey that had formed around the jar I never used. I even found Maria's old spice rack, tucked behind a stack of Tupperware. The paprika was dull. The cloves nearly fossilized. But I smiled anyway. The smell of butter and vanilla filled the kitchen. I turned off the radio and just let it sit there. No voices. No requests. Just scent and memory. When the cookies were done, I let them cool on the counter. I didn't take a picture. Didn't plate them for show. I just ate one, warm, soft, sweet enough to remind me what December used to feel like. Afterward, I sat at the table with another cup of coffee, this time black. The kind of bitter that reminded me I had a choice. Not everything needed cream and sugar to be good. I looked at the calendar on the fridge. The square for the 25th was blank. No dinner plan. No place setting. No obligation. Just a clean white box. Outside, the wind shifted, nudging the wind chimes by the back door. They rang lightly, like a question with no pressure to answer. I stood and walked to the window, coffee mug warm in my hands. A neighbor walked past with a golden retriever in a red scarf. The dog stopped to sniff my mailbox. The woman smiled up at my window. I waved without thinking. She waved back. It felt easy. I stayed there a moment longer. No one needed anything. No one expected anything. And for the first time in years, that didn't feel like loneliness. It felt like space. A space I could fill with my own breath, my own pace, my own rhythm. I thought back to all the noise. All the subtle demands. The texts that weren't really requests. The dinners that weren't really invitations. The gifts I gave that turned into obligations I never agreed to. And I realized something. Maybe silence isn't always an absence. Maybe it's permission. Turns out, silence can be sweet, if it's the kind you choose. Sunday mornings used to be quiet. I'd make a pot of tea, peel an orange, and sit by the kitchen window to read whatever paper came late or folded wrong. Sometimes I'd listen to the radio, sometimes just the ticking of the clock. I liked the slowness of it. The ease. There was a comfort in watching the world wake up without needing anything from me. That morning was different. The paper had been dropped off like usual, wedged in the mailbox crooked and a little damp around the corners. I almost didn't bring it in. Almost let it stay there until the wind blew it away or the neighbor's cat sat on it, like she sometimes did. But I brought it in. I laid it flat on the table, smoothed the wrinkled edge, and poured myself a cup of tea. Peppermint. No sugar. And then I saw it. Page 3. My name. My face. A headline printed in bold like a slap across the mouth. Spokane woman abandons elderly couple at airport during holiday storm. My eyes stayed locked on the photo. It was an old headshot, one from Jason's company website, cropped too tightly, my smile too wide and not at all how I looked anymore. I felt my breath pause in my chest. I read the article twice. The first time fast, like ripping off a bandage. The second time slower, to make sure I hadn't imagined the cruelty of it. There it was in print. Black and white. Clean font. No emotion. They called me irresponsible. Said I left Alyssa's parents standing outside in dangerous weather. That I failed to answer calls. That I refused to explain. That I was showing signs of erratic behavior and emotional instability. There was no mention of being uninvited from Christmas. No context. No history. No mortgage payments. No years of sacrifices. Just an anonymous quote from Cody Jenkins, Alyssa's father, describing how distressing the situation was. How they'd waited for over 3 hours in frigid conditions. How someone of her age should know better. Her. As if I weren't even a person to him anymore. I stood from the table, tea forgotten. I walked to the kitchen sink, held the counter, and stared at the faucet as if it could somehow explain this to me. It wasn't a storm. The day had been mild. Clear skies. No wind. The kind of winter day people in Spokane were grateful for. I had sat at home that afternoon sipping coffee, listening to the game on the radio, finally feeling like I had space to breathe. Now they were turning that silence into scandal. I went back to the table, picked up the paper, and read it again. Every word scraped against something raw inside me. The article had a byline. Patricia Morrison. Lifestyle editor. I didn't know her. But I knew her type. The kind that liked a good story better than a true one. The kind who could be swayed by a phone call from the right man in the right club, using the right voice to say the right lie. I imagined Cody sitting in his home office, sipping imported scotch, dictating the story like a script he'd rehearsed. He knew the town. He knew the people who shaped opinion. And now, apparently, he knew how to bury a woman's name under a pile of polished words and false concern. My fingers tightened around the paper. I thought about the holiday party invitations I'd seen on Alyssa's fridge. The ones addressed to the Jenkins family. I wondered if those guests would read this article. If they would nod to each other across shrimp cocktail trays and whisper about that woman who had become unhinged. I thought about the post office clerk who always asked about Jason. About the woman at church who'd told me, years ago, that I was such a giving mother. What would they think now? I looked back at the headline. Abandons elderly couple. They made me sound like a stranger in a courtroom. Like someone who had driven off in the middle of the night and never looked back. And maybe I had driven off. But it was in the middle of the day. And I didn't look back because I had nothing left to look at. I sat down, the chair creaking beneath me. The article ended with a vague statement about pending legal conversations. No source. Just enough to stir worry. The phone rang. I didn't move to answer. The machine picked up. A pause. Then a hang-up. I stared at the blinking light. Another ring. Then another. I reached out and pulled the cord from the wall. Silence returned. I folded the newspaper neatly and placed it beside my tea. The liquid had cooled. A thin skin had formed across the top. I dumped it into the sink and turned on the faucet until the water ran hot. Then I dried my hands and walked to the living room. I sat in the old recliner, the one with the faded arms and the stitching coming loose. I picked up the TV remote, held it for a moment, then set it back down. No noise. No news. Just the soft hum of the heater and the clock on the mantel, ticking forward like it always did. Outside, the wind stirred. I looked back toward the kitchen. Toward the newspaper folded on the table. They wrote me as the villain. They made me the villain. They'll read the real script soon enough. It's easy to be angry. Anyone can raise their voice, slam a door, say something sharp that echoes long after it leaves their mouth. But to sit with your fury, to hold it like a glass of water that might spill if your hand so much as trembles, that takes something else entirely. That's what I did. For 2 days, I didn't shout. I didn't text. I didn't write one of those dramatic posts people make when they want attention but not solutions. I just worked. My kitchen table became my war desk. I cleared off the cookbooks and grocery store coupons. I laid down 12 manila folders, each one neatly labeled in block letters. One for every guest I remembered seeing on Alyssa's Christmas party invite last year. She'd left it on the fridge like a trophy. I started with the mortgage statements. 5 years. 60 payments. Each one showing $2,900 withdrawn from my account and deposited into theirs. I highlighted the numbers in yellow. Not the whole row. Just the amount and the name. Enough to catch the eye. Enough to be undeniable. Next came the receipts. The mixer. The fridge. The professional-grade stove with the 6 burners and the griddle Alyssa swore she needed for serious entertaining. The bar cart. The $1,200 light fixture from some designer in Portland. I remembered how she said it, tied the room together. I didn't know then that what she really meant was, I expect you to pay for it. I pulled screenshots from her social media. Posts where she tagged brands, thanked the universe, and called their home a sanctuary of intentional luxury. One post showed a picture of their living room, fully decorated. I spotted the throw blanket I'd sent last Christmas, the one she never acknowledged receiving. Another had her smiling in front of the kitchen island. The caption said, "All this came from hard work and hustle." I printed that one twice. Just in case. I stapled each screenshot to a separate receipt. Then I moved on to the bank transfers for groceries, utilities, the emergency dental surgery Jason had 2 summers ago. Each note I made had a date, an amount, and a reason. A paper trail of trust. I drank a lot of coffee. The good kind. No reason to ration anymore. The house was quiet except for the printer chugging away, page after page sliding out warm, like fresh laundry. Every once in a while I would pause, stretch my neck, take a deep breath. Not because I was tired. Because I was getting stronger. The last thing I added to each folder was the newspaper article. I highlighted the most damning quotes. Cody's performance about how abandoned they'd felt. The phrase, holiday storm, which made it sound like I'd left them in a blizzard instead of a temperate parking lot. Beside every claim, I wrote in red pen. One word per line. False. Manipulated. Convenient. When I finished, I stacked the folders carefully. They made a satisfying sound when I lined them up. Not loud. Just sure. I stood in the kitchen, staring at them. 12 records of what I had done for people who now pretended I was the villain in their show. Outside, the wind was picking up. The sky had turned from pale blue to steel gray, like it wasn't sure whether to snow or rain. I pulled my sweater tighter and turned on the lamp in the corner. The soft yellow light made the room feel smaller. But not in a bad way. I liked the smallness. It meant I could see everything. I made a grilled cheese sandwich. Real butter. Sharp cheddar. I ate it standing at the counter, the way I used to when Jason was little and dinner was a rush between homework and bath time. I remembered how he used to ask for extra cheese. I always gave it. Even when I couldn't really spare it. Now, I couldn't remember the last time he asked me anything that didn't involve money. The phone rang twice that afternoon. I didn't answer. The machine picked up, but no one left a message. That night, I ironed a navy blouse. The one I wore to Maria's funeral. Simple, clean, strong. I laid it on the bed beside a pair of dark slacks. I checked the weather. Christmas Eve would be cold, but clear. No storm in sight. I packed the folders into a leather satchel I hadn't used in years. The zipper stuck at first, then gave way with a soft sigh. I tested the weight. Not too heavy. Just enough to carry the truth. I didn't sleep much. Not from worry. From clarity. There's a kind of calm that comes after you stop waiting for someone to do the right thing. When you realize it's your turn. When you stop playing the part of the silent supporter and become something else. Something deliberate. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to break anything. I just needed to show them who I really was. They thought I would stay quiet forever. They thought I'd stay silent forever. They were wrong. Christmas Eve arrived with the kind of quiet that makes you pause at the window and wonder what's coming. The sky was overcast but dry, the streets in Kendall Yards slick from yesterday's rain. No snow. No storm. Just a stillness that felt like the city holding its breath. I parked 2 houses down from Jason and Alyssa's. Their street was packed. SUVs and sedans lined the curb like ornaments, polished and overconfident. The kind of cars driven by people who never worried about bank balances or where the next mortgage payment came from. Their house glowed like something from a magazine cover. Warm lights in every window. Wreaths. Candles. A projection of falling snowflakes on the garage door, just faint enough to be tasteful. I sat in my truck for a moment, hands resting on the leather satchel in my lap. Inside were the 12 folders. 12 stories, really. Mine. Told in ink and receipts. In screenshots and silence broken. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't shaking. I was still. At 6:47, I got out. I walked up the path slowly. I heard laughter from inside, high and polished. The kind people practice. A fork clinked against a wine glass. A woman's voice drifted through the windows talking about sourcing organic Brussels sprouts. It would have been funny if it weren't so familiar. The door wasn't locked. Of course it wasn't. Alyssa always said the neighborhood was safe. That locking the door felt like an admission of fear. I stepped inside. The warmth hit me first. Not welcoming warmth. Oven heat. Too many bodies packed into a curated space, pretending it was effortless. The scent of roasted chicken and rosemary clung to the air, layered with whatever high-end candle Alyssa had burning on the mantel. Vanilla, maybe. Or something called winter linen. 12 people sat around the table. I knew most of them by face if not by name. Jason's coworkers. Alyssa's Pilates instructor. A couple from the neighborhood association. Her parents, of course, seated like royalty at the far end. Cody with his blazer and smug lean. Catherine in a silk blouse the color of wet stone, lips pursed like she smelled something off. They all turned when they saw me. Alyssa's smile froze mid-sentence. Jason went pale. His fork dropped to the floor. I didn't say hello. I didn't explain myself. I walked to the sideboard and set down the satchel. Slowly. Quietly. I unzipped it and pulled out the first folder. Then the second. The third. One by one, I placed them in front of each guest. 12 faces. 12 polite expressions slowly cracking. This, I said, my voice even, is what it looks like when someone gives more than they ever should have. A man in a tan sweater flipped open his folder. I saw his eyebrows rise. A woman in pearls adjusted her glasses. Catherine reached for hers as if she couldn't help herself. These are mortgage payments, I continued. Every month, for 5 years. Nearly $175,000. No one spoke. Receipts for appliances, renovations, groceries. Utility bills. Emergency loans. Interest-free, unacknowledged, and unpaid. I paused. This, I added, pulling out the final stack, is a newspaper article published 3 days ago. In it, I'm accused of abandoning Cody and Catherine at the airport during a made-up winter storm. There was no storm. There was no abandonment. There was only me saying no, for the first time in years. Jason stood, halfway. Mom, please. I turned to him. Sit down, Jason. You've had your chance to speak. His mouth opened, then closed. I handed the last copy to Alyssa. She stared at it like it might bite. You told them I was unstable, I said, my gaze fixed on Cody. That I was slipping mentally. You made calls. You planted this story. You thought no one would ask questions. That I'd stay quiet like I always have. Cody's jaw tightened. He didn't look at me. He looked at his wine glass. Someone at the table coughed. I stepped back. Let the room absorb itself. The sound of pages turning. Of quiet shame taking shape. I was told I wasn't welcome here for Christmas, I said. I was told I didn't belong. I let the silence settle like snow. I paid for the table you're sitting at. The food you're eating. The heat you're enjoying. But I was never good enough to be seen. Alyssa finally found her voice. This isn't appropriate. You're ruining. I ruined nothing, I cut in. I simply arrived. Her cheeks flushed red. Is this revenge? She asked, nearly a whisper. No, I said. This is a record. Of what was taken. Of what was never appreciated. And of what stops now. I looked around the room. At every guest. At every face pretending not to know what was going on all along. Then I turned to Jason. You let them silence me. You watched it happen. He couldn't meet my eyes. I picked up the empty satchel. The zipper whispered shut. Enjoy your dinner. And with that, I walked to the door. Behind me, the murmurs began. Soft. Uneasy. The sound of people recalculating. Not just their opinions of me, but of each other. I stepped out into the cold. The air was sharp. Fresh. Honest. I looked up at the night sky. No snow. No storm. Just stars, steady and watching. Each folder was a year of silence. Now, they had no choice but to listen. The morning after the dinner, the house felt more still than usual. Not quiet in a peaceful way. Quiet in a way that made every small sound feel louder. The hum of the fridge. The soft tick of the heater turning on. The creak in the floorboard by the pantry. All of it felt like the world was waiting for me to do something. To react. To follow up. But I didn't. I didn't call Jason. I didn't text Alyssa. I didn't check the news or scroll social media. I knew exactly what they were doing. Panic has a pattern, and I'd learned theirs by heart. Instead, I made oatmeal with cinnamon and diced apple. Sat at the kitchen table in my robe, the steam rising from the bowl in soft spirals. Outside, frost clung to the edges of the window like lace. The sun was slow to rise, bleeding orange into the sky one reluctant streak at a time. I looked at the empty seat across from me. I used to imagine Jason sitting there again someday. Maybe on a good morning, over coffee, with a grandchild tugging at my sleeve. But that seat had stayed empty for too long. And I was learning to stop filling it with ghosts. 3 days passed. No calls. No knocks on my door. But on the 4th day, I received a letter in the mail. Cream envelope. Bold type. Certified. I opened it at the sink, sunlight warming the back of my neck as I unfolded the papers. It was addressed to Jason and Alyssa, but I knew exactly what it was. A notice of default. 3 months unpaid. No resolution submitted. Next steps, foreclosure proceedings to begin within 30 days unless payment in full was received. I read it twice. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just stood there, the envelope in one hand, the kettle beginning to rumble behind me, ready for another cup of tea. They had assumed the money would always be there. That support didn't come with a structure. That love looked like bottomless credit. That I could be both the bank and the backup plan. They were wrong. I hadn't said a word to them since the dinner. Not a single message. Not a warning. I had walked in, laid down the truth, and left. The silence after that had been the loudest thing I'd ever said. And they were hearing it now. I pictured Jason reading that letter, his hands shaking like they used to when he got a C on a test. I pictured Alyssa trying to call the bank, her voice tight with panic, trying to remember which numbers she used to pretend were hers. I imagined the empty lines in their budget spreadsheets. The part where Mom used to be an invisible solution. Now she was a blank. I poured tea into my mug and brought it to the table. No cream. Just heat and bitterness, the way I liked it lately. A single sparrow landed on the windowsill, tapping the glass once with its beak before flying off again. The motion startled me. Then comforted me. The world kept moving. whether or not they caught up. Later that afternoon, I drove into town. Not for errands. Just to feel the air on my face. The city looked unchanged. But I knew it wasn't. Somewhere, Jason was pacing. Alyssa was rewriting a plan. Cody was likely blaming everyone but himself. I stopped at the co-op grocery. Bought myself a small bouquet of eucalyptus and white lilies. No reason. Just because. The cashier smiled at me and complimented my scarf. I told her thank you. I meant it. Back home, I trimmed the stems and placed the flowers in the old ceramic vase Maria and I had picked out in Santa Barbara. It had a chip in the rim but held water just fine. I set it on the windowsill in the dining room. The silence that evening was different than it had ever been before. It wasn't the kind that echoed. It was the kind that settled. That made room for breath. That let me hear my own thoughts and trust them. I didn't wonder if Jason had read every page in those folders. I knew he had. I didn't wonder if the guests at the party talked about it the next day. I knew they did. What I did wonder was how long it would take before someone knocked on my door with their eyes down, words heavy in their mouth. A confession, maybe. Or an apology. But not for me. For themselves. That night, I went to bed early. Pulled the heavy quilt up to my chin. Watched the ceiling in the dark as the furnace clicked and hissed, then rested. There was no justice I needed to force. There was only the truth. And now it was loose. I didn't need to speak. They were already listening, through fear. It was a Thursday evening when the knock came. Not loud. Not rushed. Just 3 soft taps that barely echoed through the hallway. I was in the living room, folding a quilt I'd washed that morning. The kind of domestic task I once buried myself in when emotions felt too big. Now, I did it simply because I wanted warm corners and tidy spaces. The knock came again. I looked at the clock. 6:42. I moved slowly. No part of me hurried. When I opened the door, Jason stood there. Or rather, someone wearing Jason's shape. The boy I raised had broad shoulders and spark in his eyes. This man had neither. His shirt was wrinkled. He hadn't shaved. His hair was flattened in places like he'd fallen asleep sitting up. His hands were in his coat pockets, and he couldn't quite meet my eyes. I said nothing. He cleared his throat. "Hey, Mom." I stepped aside. Not to welcome him. Just to let the cold air pass between us. He walked in, slow and unsure. His gaze skimmed the room like it didn't quite belong to his memory. I had rearranged the furniture recently. New chair from a thrift shop. Fresh curtains in soft green. A small round table by the window that held my tea, my books, my stillness. Jason sat at the kitchen table. The one I'd bought with the leftover from my first retirement check that didn't go to anyone but me. It was smaller than the one we used to have. But somehow, it felt more mine. He didn't speak right away. Just sat with his shoulders hunched like he was expecting judgment to fall from the ceiling. I boiled water for tea. Didn't ask if he wanted any. He watched me move around the kitchen like he didn't quite remember where anything belonged. Finally, he said, "I didn't know it would fall apart so fast." I turned. Let him look at my face. I didn't nod. I didn't soften. "It always looked easy when you did it," he said, and for a second, his voice cracked. I placed a cup in front of him anyway. Plain mug. No message. No comfort. He wrapped his hands around it like he needed something to hold that wouldn't pull away. "We got the final notice yesterday," he said. "The bank said the house goes up for auction if we can't make a full payment in 2 weeks." I sat across from him, still silent. Jason looked up at me, and finally, he let the words come out the way they always should have been. "I'm sorry, Mom." I heard it. The tremble. The way "sorry" can still be pride wrapped in a last defense. But it was more than I'd been given in years. I waited. Let him sit in it. He stared at his hands. "Alyssa's been talking to her parents. Trying to see if they can loan us anything. But they won't touch it. Not now." I nodded once. And I should have never let it get like this. I should have seen what we were doing to you. I should have stopped her, stopped myself. My hands were resting on the edge of the table. My palms were warm, but something under my ribs stayed cold. I kept thinking you'd always be there. You always were. That part hurt. Not because it was wrong, but because it was the truest thing he said. "I miss you," he added, almost whispering. "I miss you at dinner. I miss you with the kids. I miss how you always knew what to say." I looked at him then. Really looked. He wasn't the man I hoped he'd grow into. But he wasn't the child who once clung to my skirt at the grocery store either. He was something else. Someone learning. Too late, maybe. But learning. "I don't know how to fix this," he said. That was the moment I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I was tired. Not bone-tired. Not bitter. Just done. I stood and poured myself another cup of tea. Let the warmth spread down to my fingertips. Jason looked up, eyes searching for something I wasn't ready to give. "I just wanted you to know," he said. "That I see it now." I nodded. "Thank you." He waited. Maybe for forgiveness. Maybe for rescue. Neither came. He finished his tea in silence. When he stood to leave, he hesitated. Like he wasn't sure if he should hug me. If I would want that. If he deserved it. I stepped back slightly. Not cold. Just clear. He nodded. Walked to the door. Put his hand on the knob. Then paused. "I love you, Mom." I believe he meant it. I believe he always did, in his own incomplete way. But some things don't have a door you can walk back through. Some places, once cracked, never carry the same air again. He walked out into the cold. I didn't follow. I watched from the window as he stood by his car for a moment, head bowed, keys in hand. The porch light lit the top of his head like a spotlight in a play that no longer needed him in the final act. He got in and drove away. I washed the mugs. Wiped the table clean. Folded the silence around me like a soft shawl. My son had come back. But I wasn't ready to return. Forgiveness is not forgetting. That's what I told myself the morning I wrote the letter. Not an email. Not a text. A real letter. Ink on paper. Folded with care. Tucked inside an envelope I'd kept from a set Maria gave me years ago, back when we still believed in thank you notes and birthday cards that said more than, "Hope it's a good one." I made coffee before I began. The good kind again. I'd stopped saving it for special occasions. The act of writing this, of setting it all down with calm hands and a steady voice, that was special enough. The house was quiet. Morning light spilled across the floor in thin golden slats. I could hear the neighbors' wind chimes clinking gently outside. Somewhere down the street, a car door slammed, and a dog barked twice, sharp and distant. I sat at the dining table. No distractions. Just me and the page. Jason had come back. Not in full. Not yet. But enough for me to see the boy I raised under the man he had become. He had sat at my table and apologized. That mattered. But apologies aren't payment. And motherhood isn't debt. So I began. Dear Jason, I wrote, and I paused for a long moment before I continued. I told him I loved him. That part came first because it was still true. It had always been true, even when it was buried under fatigue and disappointment and the kind of silence that feels too heavy to speak through. Then I told him the truth. That I didn't blame him entirely. That I understood how easy it is to fall into comfort, to let someone else carry the weight when they seem so willing. But I also told him this. No more secrets. No more late-night calls that start with, just this once. No more Alyssa speaking for him. If he wanted to rebuild trust, it had to be one brick at a time. With his own hands. With full weight. I didn't ask him to leave her. That wasn't my place. But I made it clear. I would no longer pretend that her words didn't wound. That her choices hadn't left scars. If she wanted to come back into my life, it would be with truth on her tongue and no arrogance in her eyes. There would be no more silent forgiveness. No more quiet giving. From now on, every dollar would be named. Every visit would be real. Every boundary respected. I told him that if he truly wanted to rebuild, it would not be through repair. It would be through reintroduction. Start from where we left off, I wrote. But not the last time you asked for something. The last time you looked at me like a person. I didn't write it to be cold. I wrote it to be clear. Love isn't the absence of condition. It's the presence of choice. And I was choosing myself now. I signed the letter with my full name. Not Mom. Not Mother. Just the woman I had always been beneath those titles. The woman who had stood by him, paid for him, fed him, held him, and now, finally, was ready to hold herself first. I slipped the letter into the envelope, sealed it, and pressed the flap closed with both palms like a quiet prayer. I didn't mail it. Not yet. I kept it on the counter beside the fruit bowl. Let it sit there for a day, maybe two. I wanted to see it. To feel it in the room. To be sure I wasn't writing from emotion but from resolve. That afternoon, I made a pot roast. Not because anyone was coming. Just because I liked the smell of rosemary and garlic filling the house. I set the table for one. Ate slowly. Savored the taste of salt and warmth. The kind of meal I'd once rushed through because someone always needed something. Now, I needed nothing but peace. Later that night, I walked to the mailbox under a cold sky. The stars were out, sharp and steady. I slipped the envelope in and let it go. My hands didn't shake. My breath didn't catch. I went back inside and washed my hands in warm water. Then I sat down by the fire, wrapped in the same quilt I'd folded earlier that week. The one with the frayed edges and the memories sewn in quiet patterns. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's remembering without letting it destroy you. And I remembered everything. The dinners I paid for. The tears I wiped. The silence I swallowed. But I also remembered who I was before all of that. A woman with her own laugh. Her own limits. Her own light. I forgave him. But I didn't forget. And I wasn't free anymore. I forgave. But I didn't forget. And I'm no longer free. Christmas morning arrived the way winter always does in Spokane, quiet, gray, and honest. The sky hung low, heavy with clouds that couldn't quite decide whether to rain or snow. I opened the curtains slowly, letting the soft light pour across the floorboards like spilled milk. It touched the edge of the rug, the bookshelf, the armchair by the window where I'd sat just the night before, hands wrapped around a warm mug, watching the hours slide gently into Christmas Day. I didn't make a big breakfast. No pancakes. No fuss. Just 2 slices of toast, golden and crisp, a pat of butter melting slow into the ridges. I sipped my coffee in silence. The good kind, as always now. Ground fresh. Just the right bitterness to balance the quiet sweetness in my chest. At 10:15, I packed up the pie. Apple. The way my mother taught me. Tart and sweet with a hint of cinnamon and a brushed egg wash on top. The crust was golden, bubbling slightly where the filling had kissed the edge. I'd made it the night before, letting it rest on the windowsill like some kind of small ceremony. I wrapped it in a clean dish towel, the one with blue stripes. Placed it carefully in the passenger seat like it was more than dessert. In a way, it was. The drive to Ruth's house took 42 minutes. Roads were mostly clear. The city felt half asleep, its heartbeat slower than usual. I passed neighborhoods with glowing reindeer on the lawns and plastic Santas perched on rooftops. Some homes had curtains drawn wide. Others stayed closed tight. But the quiet felt gentle, not lonely. When I pulled into Ruth's driveway, I paused a moment before turning off the engine. Her house looked exactly as it always had. Yellow paint a little faded. Wind chimes by the porch. 2 ceramic frogs by the steps, one with a missing eye. Ruth opened the door before I knocked. "You brought the pie," she smiled. "I always do," I said. Inside, her home smelled like rosemary, cloves, and something faintly citrus. The fireplace was lit. Not roaring, just steady. A low hum of jazz played from the old stereo in the corner, Ella Fitzgerald dipping in and out of the trumpet. Her grandkids, my second cousin's little ones, were sprawled on the living room rug, half unwrapping gifts, half dozing from too much sugar and excitement. One of them, a boy with hair that stood straight up like he'd slept on a balloon, looked up at me and grinned. "Hi, Aunt May," he said, though we weren't related in any real way. But that was okay. I set the pie on the counter. Ruth handed me a mug of cider. Warm, with a cinnamon stick tucked inside. We stood in the kitchen for a moment, just the 2 of us. "I'm glad you came," she said, touching my wrist. "I am too," I replied. And I meant it. We ate around her old oak table, the one with 3 mismatched chairs and a bench that creaked every time someone shifted. No place cards. No expectations. Just a big pot of roasted vegetables, a ham from the butcher, and my pie, which disappeared faster than I expected. No one asked why I wasn't at Jason's. No one asked if I was okay. And that was the best part. They let me be. I laughed. Full-bodied. Loud. The kind that rose up without apology. Someone spilled cranberry sauce. Someone else told a terrible joke about Santa and a snowplow. One of the little girls crawled into my lap after dessert and asked if I knew how to braid doll hair. I did. Later, after the dishes were stacked and the fire burned lower, I stepped outside with a blanket around my shoulders. The porch was cold, but the air felt sharp and real against my skin. I breathed it in like something sacred. Across the street, I saw a family pulling into their driveway. Laughter spilled from the car as they unloaded bags and leftovers. A woman in a red scarf twirled in the snow. Somewhere nearby, wind chimes danced. I thought of Jason. Of the letter I sent. Of the silence that followed. And I realized something. Not all stories end with reunion. Some end with reclamation. This wasn't revenge. Or bitterness. It was balance. I didn't need a full table to feel full. I needed a seat where I wasn't forgotten. And I had found it. I walked back inside, the blanket trailing behind me. Ruth handed me another sliver of pie. "You sure?" she asked, half laughing. "I'm sure," I smiled. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't eating out of obligation. I was choosing. Where I sat. Who I listened to. What I let into my heart. And that mattered more than any apology ever could. For the first time in years, I had Christmas that felt real. Not because I was invited, but because I chose where I was wanted.